Thank you, Mr. Dalamini. We will now begin with the first keynote session for which Mr. Ben Vershbow would chair the session. Mr. Ben Vershbow is the Director of Community Programs at the Wikimedia Foundation, the non-profit organization supporting Wikipedia, Wikidata, and nearly a dozen other open knowledge projects. He leads a globally distributed team focused on growing participation and partnership across the Wikimedia movement in key knowledge areas such as GLAM, education, science, and gender diversity. May I request Mr. Vershbow to take the session forward, please.
Good morning. It's wonderful to be here, and it's a real honor to be at UNESCO here in Delhi. Before I introduce Professor Das, I just wanted to share a few framing thoughts that are sort of picking up on where the closing session left off yesterday. Mr. I'm going to mispronounce his name, John Men Udenaren, who gave that virtual presentation on the World Digital Library, reflecting on one of the early efforts to create a common digital heritage platform. Mr. Van Udenaren posed an interesting thought that digital libraries should mediate between the heterogeneity of the cultural collections that they are aggregating and the homogeneity that users expect. I was reflecting on this a lot last night and into this morning, and I'm not sure homogeneity is quite the word I would look to, but I see what he was getting at, and I think that this is the challenge I think aggregators have faced as they've tried to kind of scoop up vast amounts of heterogeneous content and try to offer that coherently to a vast public. Moving from homogeneity, I started to contemplate perhaps the notion of connectivity or fluidity or serendipity, which of course I think is the hallmark of all great libraries. And I would also like to, at the end of his talk, Van Udenaren also made a critique of the current age of aggregators, which I thought was interesting and should be kind of borne in mind. Perhaps the fallacy of trying to work at that scale and simply to put that kind of vast heterogeneity behind a search box and expect that people will just come. And I was reflecting that maybe a year or two after the World Digital Library launched, another really bold early experiment in digital aggregation launched, which was the Flickr Commons. Are folks here familiar with the Flickr Commons? Do people remember? This was perhaps the first credible attempt at scale to aggregate cultural collections. And it was a springboard because of its APIs and infrastructure for experimentation and creative reuse, remixing, and playfulness in a way that we had never seen. And I think that we're still kind of working in the wake of that. Flickr Commons required significant preparatory work in terms of rights assessment, as we know. We all remember the famously kind of soft focus designation, no known rights restrictions, which now sort of lives on in the rights statements framework. But there was not an overly laborious preparation around the metadata. It was actually for the Flickr communities to come together in collaboration with the institutions to develop that fluidity, to develop that connectivity, to develop that serendipity. And I think that's what made the Flickr Commons experiment so magical. And it's something I think we're still trying to emulate. And certainly in the Wikimedia movement, as we've been working through in a very distributed fashion to aggregate heritage at global scale, I think we've been rehearsing for the largest scale aggregation yet. And we think that regional aggregators have a key role to play in this, in kind of assembling this full picture of global heritage. So I just wanted to kind of put that additional marker in the history of early attempts at aggregation with Flickr Commons to reflect on that. And I think it's a thought we have to bear in mind, that fluidity and that connectivity and that serendipity that we're trying to foster. So I will now introduce Professor Das. Dr. Partha Pratim Das is the joint principal investigator of the National Digital Library of India, which is sponsored by the MHRD, the government of India. He is a professor at the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at IIT Kharagpur and heads the Rajendra Mishra School of Engineering Entrepreneurship. His current interests include human-computer interaction, computer analysis of Indian classical dance, which is something I learned about the other day, which is absolutely fascinating, technology-enabled education, and software engineering. So I'll hand it over to Professor Das. to propose a grand vision for SAARC, or regional cooperation on global heritage.
Thank you, Ben. Good morning, everybody. It's really nostalgic to be back here in this UNESCO building to conduct the next version of KEDL without the presence of Indrajit. I know maybe some of you haven't met him, but those who had would understand our repeated recollection of this great person. In fact, this initiative of creating a SAARC platform was one of the key points that Indrajit and I had discussed by the sidelines of 2017. And we were supposed to hold a meeting in Paris in 2018 to initiate the process, which could not happen because of his failing health and eventual demise. But I'm happy that we have been able to assemble together to take that vision forward. With that note, Ben has given the basic perspective of why we are here. And this is being called a keynote. I mean, I'm not really an expert of any of the things that I'm going to talk here. I'm more an aggregator of knowledge by now. But I wanted to make a small presentation on what's happening around the world in terms of digital heritage and how I see that digital heritage is becoming a very effective tool of cooperation and growth in global as well as specialized regional areas. So just to recap what digital heritage is. We all know what is heritage, and we all are familiar with the three major well-accepted dimensions of heritage: tangible, intangible, and natural. But as we have seen for long, that as we move from library to digital library, it is just not a digital version of a library which is a digital library, because it gives you opportunities which go well beyond the digital presentation of content. Because it also, in my view, gives you an opportunity to create a kind of virtual heritage. And UNESCO, in its agenda, has been very supportive, very constructive about this, and this is what I show on the slide there is actually lifted from UNESCO's statements on their website. It's made up of computer-based materials of enduring value, and enduring value is of a great significance here. That should be kept for future generations. But when we talk digitally, there is a lot more than the typical heritage that we can do. Certainly, on your left, you can see the first thing that we start talking about is documentation, which has been there in certain form, in physical form for several centuries possibly, but in digitally it becomes far more powerful to document, subsequently to represent, and finally to present or disseminate. So that's where virtuality starts creating a lot of new dimensions. And I will just later in my presentation make references to some of the great projects that India has been involved in terms of using these expansions of virtual heritage technologies to not only create a digital version of the heritage, but create tools which can actually help preserve and present heritage. So, in that context, this is again from UNESCO's Charter. So, UNESCO, I find, is a great partner in terms of working on heritage, and especially digital heritage. And UNESCO has a published charter for digital heritage, which says resources of human knowledge or expression, whether cultural, educational, scientific and administrative, or embracing technical, legal, medical and other kinds of information, are increasingly created digitally or converted into digital form from existing resources. So that's the context of the charter. And what it says in terms of the second point is the resources are born digital. Now, in the context of heritage, a lot of new born digital contents have started appearing. Because when we talk in the context of library, it's significantly two-dimensional documents we are talking of. But when we go to heritage, then it significantly gets a third dimension, because there are a lot of particularly tangible physical heritage has three-dimensional presence. A lot of intangible heritage like music, like dance, have a very strong temporal dimension. It is, as we professionals call it, a two and a half dimensional space where you have a two-dimensional view which keeps on changing in the third temporal dimension, particularly in the dance. In music, it happens in the audio domain. And quite a rich reference to that. I hope most of you have been present in Harry's presentation yesterday. So we have heard about their time travel project. Probably it's called Time Machine, right? The Time Machine project, which talks about this new dimension of born digital contents. And they create a kind of heritage dimension where the vision is going up to actually taking this three-dimensional visions over time. And that's what he called as four-dimensional heritage view. So UNESCO's charter is ready for supporting these kind of data, these kind of initiatives. And that's what primarily we want to leverage. So I'll just take a look around some of the major digital heritage initiatives across the world. I'm sure most of you would be aware of most of these initiatives, but just to bring all of us at the same platform and then take that agenda forward in terms of what we can do in terms of a SAARC platform. Library of Congress, though not probably is a leader in digital heritage collection, but certainly is the most leading library in the world, which has some unbelievable number of user base, and content collection was created primarily for the purpose of the Congress, but in terms of their activities, in terms of their coverage, there is a very varied number of different heritage programs. They are very strong in terms of newspaper program. In fact, while I was visiting Library of Congress in 2018 summer, so actually John, who made the WDL presentation, he was guiding me through. He was was with Library of Congress. So he wanted to say, tell me your vernacular newspaper that you are familiar with it. So I said one, thinking that he's kind of joking. Then he went and showed me the previous day's edition of that newspaper. So I'm just trying to say that Library of Congress looks at a heritage which is very integrative, very global. Naturally, keeping aside the challenges of heterogeneity or homogeneity, all this, the fact that sheer collection gives you a view which is very expansive. But in my personal assessment, since this is so expansive, this finally does not have a single or a few very strong heritage motives or cultural dimensions, because with that much of diversity, you really cannot have a very strong message inside. But a great collection, a great effort, and great lot of things to learn from the Library of Congress. Moving on, it would be, may not be very proper for me to comment, because The expert is right here. We have heard Harry yesterday. But I have been really fascinated, and I really started thinking about a SAARC platform after I learnt about the Europeans' experience in depth. And just to recollect what Harry commented and earlier Paul and others had told me is the European Union drives European, and this was decided again at the time when a giant corporate power, Google, wanted to, in the guise of being very generous to culture, actually was trying to do a monopolization of culture. And if you go across different big libraries in United States itself, I was recently at Las Vegas Clark County Public Library, New York Public Library, all of them have had Google Books program with me, where the offer was really difficult to resist from. Google offered, as Harry was explaining, that they will come in with all resources, they will take the books that are copyright free, digitize them, give you a copy, and so on. The TNC apply, terms and conditions apply, written in font size 6 or 5, is for 15 years, Google will hold the rights to disseminate that content. Again, in the first look, that looks like, well, a very generous offer, because if you get disseminated through Google, then your feasibility is extremely huge. But what subsequently started concerning people is, if it disseminated through Google, then Google filters apply. And nobody knows what those filters actually are. How much of those filters are in terms of organic mechanisms which are applied in terms of which contents are being more popular and so on. Question is, if you are talking about digital heritage, do you really want always that the organic filter would come in? Because in terms of heritage, often a content is really valuable because it's scarcely viewed, scarcely known. So it's not, Google's general principle is more viewed is more important, is applicable in certain context. In context of heritage, it may actually be dangerous. So which will mean that more of the marginal heritage items will get even more marginalized. But heritage's whole effort is to balance the value, human value, the cultural value that we have. And eventually, I learned that most of the major public libraries eventually has closed down that Google Books program. They have showcased scanner saying Google project used to be here. But of course, whatever has been scanned is already there, you can't take that back. So it's important to note. Now, I would also mention in this that it is not only the big giant libraries. We were toddling at 2016, had about maybe 1 million content somehow collected from different sources, and very little we could put together from ours. Notably, it was Satyajit Ray, the great filmmaker's 39 film scripts, which only existed and still is the only source on NDLI. When Google Books actually made an offer, they came over and they made a similar offer to us, that be the coordinator, get the books, we will digitize, give you a copy, everything, you don't have to pay. We didn't know much about all these backgrounds. I just instinctively said no. I don't know why I said no. But I said no because I was not well informed. I said, then I kept on asking who did this. They said, we did it there, we did it. I said, tell me few countries where you are doing it. They had very few to answer, and none of so-called the more active countries. So it is, on one side it is a great initiative. I mean, we shouldn't only criticize the commercial attention to heritage, because that also brings in resources, brings in money. If collaborative in the right way, could be effective, but at the same time there are risks which we'll have to assess. But subsequently, learning more from European, what really struck me is, well, this was probably a trigger, but necessarily helped European Union to react with it in a very positive way. Deciding to create an identity for one of the most diverse region of culture, so many languages, so many different deep historical background, often very aligned, often extremely combative in the past, but it's remarkable to see how European Union could rise and create something like European. And there's a great to learn from that. I'm very happy Harry is here. Ben has been quite involved in all these as well. So if you look into this and the way this has been structured, Harry a little bit discussed about that as well. Particularly, Harry was talking more on the collection side and the teachers and all that. But as you can see, there are different varied dimensions, and it is important to understand those. There are components in develop, which is really good learning platform, cooperation platform for all those who want to work more inside the technology. There's research, quite a bit of. There's a networking component. So gives you not only an instance of a great digital heritage library, but a great digital heritage library framework. That's very important, because it means that if we manage to do something together, there's a lot of wheels which we do not need to rediscover. The practices, best practices are available. Most of the knowledge created in this process is open. There are very good documents in terms of what are the issues in rights and how to manage them, how to address those. So this gives a very good, at least reference for us to go forward on this. Trove is another, which is not an aggregation in that national sense, in that multi-country sense, but it is an initiative which I find again very fascinating, because it again takes a dimension which tries to, for example, focus very significantly on indigenous knowledge. I'm just trying to pick up components from different initiatives, which I see a strong similarity with what we have in terms of the SAARC region. So indigenous knowledge is something again which the SAARC countries have in a great extent, and Trove has been doing really great work in terms of, and they have a great focus to bring in all those indigenous knowledge, languages and all that in terms of this platform. Besides, somehow Trove has got known for their newspaper program, because that's a great one. But this has been a great effort to learn from as well. And if you look into the structure again, I'm trying to not only see that end user value, but I'm trying to somewhat look at it from creators' perspective as to, does it give a framework that we can adopt from. So we can see that they have a very well structured framework, which in matters where if we decide and align with those activities, we can really use that framework. And Trove has been also been very connected to us through right statements, steering committees. Trove representative could not finally be present in KEDL. They were invited and they had accepted initially, but couldn't make time. So this is the second that I would like to point out to you. DPLA is more as it says, Digital Public Library of America is more an America, USA centric effort. It's a derivative one. But has been in the leading with European in several of the generic issues and solutions that came in this space. Very significantly, it follows a similar hub and spoke model that Harry was mentioning about, And it also brings in another different aspects of the point that, well, if this initiative, such an initiative has to happen, there needs to be a strong partner to back or support the whole thing. DPLA, as I understand, has gone through several, it's kind of the model in which NDLI currently works. It's a funded project. So DPLA often has gone through that and has gone through its ups and downs. And we have seen very active friends of DPLA being bid goodbye, not many positions and so on. So those are other aspects that we have to keep in mind, that it may be euphoric to start an initiative, but unless we have some vision into the sustainability, it's finally not going to be there for a while. World Digital Library, we heard the creator speak last night. It has been a very, in terms of quality of what it produces, it's a great effort. Multiple languages, all, even languages plus Portuguese, and a relatively small collection of about 20,000 items. But if you look into the depths of what has been created, if you look into the user connect that these items have, is exceptionally different from most other initiatives. But naturally, John yesterday pointed out the different dimensions of what was right and what was wrong. And the core point to take back is you need a sustainability model, which WDL unfortunately could not have. There has been revival proposals for WDL. I was fortunate to be present in that formative meeting. We haven't had the follow-ups which were supposed to happen in September, October this year, so I do not exactly know what's happening. Some other organization is trying to take that up. Those stories apart, but one thing I feel is to learn strongly from WDL is how to ensure quality and uniformity of presentation. I would not call homogeneity, but uniformity of presentations is no matter which culture you are looking at through WDL, you will have a similar experience. And that probably is quite difficult to create, but it's a great effort anyway. These are, for example, this timeline is a very great feature in WDL, which gives you a very nice picture in terms of, on a certain event or a certain concept, how heritage has evolved over a period of time. And I'm sure this has been a great amount of effort required to create this. DLME, Digital Library of the Middle East, it's still kind of a evolving project, and I kept it, and as I had expected, Ezekiel also mentioned about this, because this is talking about some kind of a virtual heritage, because it's been created, motivated by the fact that there's terrorism not only against the property and human life and business, but there is terrorism against culture, there's terrorism against ethnicity, there's terrorism against heritage. And in the certain Middle East region, this has been identified to be really threatening, where libraries are getting burned and monuments are being pulled down. So DLME has been an effort to preserve and revive those in a digital form. So it's an initiative of a little different kind. It's again a completely funded project, so it's till to get its strong foundation or its sustainability in place, and it's supported primarily by the Antiquities Coalition. So what I'm trying to point out is this talks about a collaboration which is not exactly geographical in nature, or primarily the uniformity of the culture is not the first objective. The first objective is the nature of threats that have come in terms of the heritage. So each one of these has a strong, binding thread on which that initiative has been created. There's another which I wanted to talk on, but I couldn't actually. that I could not really, collect enough material in English to be able to do that. That initiative is called SRILA. It's Silk Route International Library Association, Alliance possibly, which is driven by National Library of China. And in the past there used to be a Silk Route from the Middle East to China, which is to go through a couple of 1,000 kilometers in parts of India and different other countries. So there's an initiative on that. Unfortunately, even though about 40% of the Silk Route actually passed through Dedan, India. India is not a part of SRILA. So it's I'm not very sure about the inclusiveness of that project, but and another main difficulty is since it's driven by China, that it's very significantly documented in Chinese, even about the library, and also I couldn't get enough information on that, but it does exist. So does again talk about the fact that people do try to recognize heritage and preservation in geographic terms, in terms of threats, as well as in terms of certain strong practices the past had. So Silk Route is what gave a trade route, which then, because of the trade, created a different type of culture and heritage. If you look through all these, then these are some of the points that come out as common: public access, interoperability, provide, preserve, and promote are the main things that are happening. Build capacity, share history, new knowledge. So these are what these libraries are creating. I'll take a very quick look in terms of some of the Indian initiatives. How much time do I have? I can skip this. Oh. So India, and kind of when I start talking about heritage and say India, in my mind I am really confused, because if I talk about what is presently politically the boundary of India, then it gets very difficult to define this heritage. For example, tomorrow you will hear a professor from Curtin University. He's talking on digital temples. And when you talk about Indian temples, you can never characterize them with the current political boundary of India, because it goes way down to Myanmar, even beyond. On that side goes up to at least crosses Peshawar. So, but this is the characteristic dimensions of heritage that you can see are the temples, murals, paintings, sculpture, and of a very wide time period, manuscripts, and very wide dimensions. Now, what I'll not go into details, neither I have time, and also the fact that both of these projects that are mentioned here will be particularly spoken of by the creators tomorrow. So one is digital heritage preservation, where the main focus is using digital technologies in varied forms of reconstruction. So that when, for example, if you look between, this is the current structure, this is somewhere in Karnataka. So this is the current model of the current structure which currently exists. And by other documents and other skates and all that, it has been reconstructed. You can see this part, which actually has got torn down. You can see here, this is broken, this is reconstructed. So there is a big set of efforts in terms of reconstructing, and not only reconstructing by extrapolation of what currently exists in the structure, but you use a varied amount of knowledge, including information from different manuscripts, reportings by different visitors, as well as paintings, and do reconstruction. So we'll hear Professor Shantanu Chaudhary tomorrow. We'll talk on these efforts. These are after you have, if you take a region, you have reconstructed it virtually, then you can actually create a virtual tour, which these teams are trying to do, so that you can show that it's not only what the reconstruction could have been, but if you were in the 600 AD and walking on this field, then how would it feel? So I think these are great dimensions in terms of what different projects are doing. This is our modest effort in terms of digitization, which have just got started. Now, I will conclude in 2 minutes with reinforcing the agenda. So, having seen all these over the last 2.5 years that I have been extremely, extensively traveling in US, in Europe, and in this region as well, it does strike me that amongst us in the SAARC countries, we have a heritage which is significantly common, because we have had a lot of common trade, we have common food habits, we have a extremely overlapped language boundaries. I mean, in India, we are talking about 22 languages of India. That does cover all languages almost that SAARC countries deal with. I mean, we share Bengali with Bangladesh, we share Tamil with Sri Lanka, we share Nepali with Nepal, and so on. And we have been, this region have been significantly been ruled by a common ruler who contributed very significantly in terms of building up an education system. And so after the history of different geographic boundaries put on that region, the education systems remain more or less similar. The cultural evolution remains more or less similar. So it does make sense that physically we may be separated, but virtually we can again combine together. And that's the digital heritage dimension of SAARC that I'm trying to visualize. And when you try to do that, you have to cut through several government tapes. And to put matters straight, our project is under MHRD, and public libraries are under Ministry of Culture. In 4 years, I have not been able to make these two ministries meet and make NDLI available through public libraries. Given that state of government affairs, I have not been very hopeful of taking it absolutely to the government level and doing it the way European Union did. So that's where I find UNESCO to be a great partner, because it can cut through. You go through UNESCO, no government questions you. You are a UNESCO partner, and UNESCO is very positively reacted to that. So that's what I mean by neutral umbrella. So because our only interest is preserve the cultural heritage of our region, and we can create very effective cultural programs. UNESCO has offices in almost all of these countries. This office itself covers about 5 of the countries. So
actually have more time than I realized.
that's fine.
You're good.
So I want to end with a few questions, which I'm sure the panel can take up and discuss. So first, naturally, we would like to hear about reactions to this kind of seed proposal, that what the different countries think about the digital heritage. To know about the situation in different countries, I have some little idea about some of them, like some part of what's happening in Bangladesh, but not generically about most of them. So what kind of efforts, projects, policies do participating countries have in this field? Would the participating countries be open to digital heritage exchange? That's a very basic requirement. What are your thoughts on integrated exchange platform? How do you think whether UNESCO as a platform? I mean, I think we should be open in terms of discussing this. UNESCO is just a proposal. They have been supportive, but that does not necessarily mean that that's the only way we should look at UNESCO can support it. In terms of if we use other platforms, for example, do we directly go to SAARC and request SAARC as a platform and UNESCO to come with us? What kind of heritage programs do you want to collaborate on with India in specific? This is, I wanted to raise this question because we have some infrastructure created in terms of a digital library. So, I mean, there's a physical existence of a virtual world now, which is pretty much under our control. So maybe quite a few things can be immediately built up on that. Knowledge wheels can be exploited. And there are number of digital heritage projects and initiatives in India which we are trying to bring together. So one way, for example, the Digital Temple Project, when you'll hear from Professor Datta, you'll hear that he has actually worked with 5 or 6 countries to create that temple map. It's not limited to the Indian boundary. And certainly more on what are the ways that UNESCO can facilitate these exchanges. We will hear from UNESCO representatives in terms of what options exist for this platform. So that was my modest thought on proposing that we in this region come together and try to take effective steps, because it may not be Antiquity Coalition saying that there is threat on digital heritage or specific attack on digital heritage, but I'm sure all of us also keep seeing that there has been degeneration, natural or otherwise. Like I remember the earthquake in Nepal destroyed, several volumes of manuscripts which will never be found again. So in this context, I would hand it over back to Ben to conclude this, and subsequently in the panel I'm sure we'll have a good deliberation, and we have experts here from outside the panel also to learn from. Thank you all very much for the time.
Thank you, Professor Das. It's a very inspiring proposal, and it's thrilling to be present for what could be the beginning of a longer conversation about this. I think there's nothing left for me to do but to kind of bring this to a close toward the tea break, and then I think after a short pause we will move this into a panel discussion mode. Just bringing it back to some of the things I was mentioning at the top, I think this is an opportunity not just to survey the landscape, which Professor Das has very capably done, but to think about opportunities when you're starting something fresh, to maybe leap ahead and adopt a different paradigm. Again, recalling some of the early experiments and that kind of blend of institutional cooperation with broad-based crowdsourcing. These ways of making meaning-making with your audience. Also, we're looking at a lot of web-based platforms, and obviously the world has moved in a very different direction. What would a mobile-first digital heritage fabric look like for this region? Perhaps a different mode of curation. What if citizens of these countries could receive one artifact a day on their phones with deep context? It's an opportunity, I think, to think in a different way about aggregating heritage. That how do you actually make it meaningful to people's lives? Sometimes scale is actually not the way to go. I think there's almost an addiction to scale, the large numbers that we post about these aggregator projects. The scale does matter, but I think there's also an intimacy to heritage that we want to foster, and that we can lose sight of that when we're trying to build these massive platforms. So I think just some things to ponder. I think we've sometimes have been reinventing the wheel despite best intentions. So I think this is a very exciting opportunity to think boldly and innovatively and show the world how it could be done even better. So what is the next step? Yeah, I'll hand it over.
We can take some questions.
Yeah, does anyone have questions for Professor Das' presentation?
Would anyone like to ask any question? Anybody?
Or Mr. Glamini, what does UNESCO think of this proposal?
Good morning to everyone, and I'm very much delighted to have such kind of presentation by Professor P.P. Das. Sir, could we correlate with the SAARC Charter towards the SAARC Secretariat regarding this on the umbrella of UNESCO like this? Because SAARC Charter specifically, Article 5 mentioned that education, human resource development and youth mobilization under this article, heritage and this cultural heritage used to incorporate with like this. So SAARC Secretary now it is in Nepal. So I think UNESCO can take initiatives to go through the SAARC countries. Then it would be more officialized, and beside your proposal or beside your thoughts, whatever you say, the modest thought. So that would be enriched for this. So my proposal is that how can we correlate the things with the NDL, with the SAARC charter?
Actually, that's a little bit more on the procedural side. So when we, myself, Ezekiel, Ashita, when we deliberated on this session, there was a thought as to whether we involve SAARC as well. We stayed away from that because we felt that first we need to decide amongst ourselves what we want. The proposal comes at an stage, so we have to work on that proposal. It's just because NDLI has been working, and I just thought that, some of us just thought that let there be a platform for a common digital heritage will not make things happen. Till the partners also can think, deliberate, they have to go back, talk to their colleagues. And then those are the procedural steps which will be, I'm sure, brought out in time.
My question is, I just wanted to say regarding Bangladesh, we are doing a lot of things in digital libraries and we are doing a lot of works, not combinedly. We are working basically individually. So I think awareness building is very important in Bangladesh, especially in policy, those who are involved with policy making. So do you have any plan to organize some collaboration or like any training or workshop especially for awareness building program? So in that case, the government of Bangladesh, they do realize, but they will give more importance to do such kind of collaboration between the SAARC countries, because this is a very initial level, so we need to work on it.
I think it will be best to deliberate on this in the panel or towards the end, because once we know the situation of the
Individual
other
countries.
representatives as well, and he will also be presenting in the panel. Sir will also be presenting, so we can certainly discuss that.
Yes. There's one more lady at the back, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Das. It was a very nice presentation. I would really like to know about the contents that you would like to include in your these sort of projects, because for example in Bangladesh there are different sort of indigenous groups, so there are different sort of cultures in Bangladesh that has been there. So how would you like gather their what they have to provide you, how would you collect those things? Similarly, not only resources or materials, there are stories that our grandparents used to tell us, that these are the culture of these places, and there are lullabies that has been lost, I suppose. So how do you think that you can preserve those sort of things? Like, would you go from person to person and you would collect those things from them? Like, it's sort of a management of the indigenous knowledge or some kind of tacit knowledge management. So how would you plan to do all this?
Thank you, Taman. That's a great question. I would like to put it a little differently. We are talking about a vision. The way it goes is you start around a vision. If you agree on the vision, then you have to first decide what is your mission statements. And then comes working out a scope and broad objectives. Then you have to decide on the processes that you will set up. And actual contents or procedures of doing it will come much later, because if we hurriedly jump to that then we will not have a structure to that whole thing. Right? So obviously those questions will come up, those contexts, I'm sure. Context of lullabies, I'm sure, is there in each of the countries. And it is very, very important to preserve those. But that's not the only way. But we are at the vision level right now. So if you have something to comment on that as to whether the appropriateness or the specificity of that, that's what will be more relevant right now. We'll naturally have to come to all these if we agree on the vision and start with it.
Thank you so much.
I thought it was incredibly interesting to see, or to hear from you, Professor Das, the comparative study that you've made across the digital libraries. I would ask, actually, Mr. Glamini, if you could elaborate a little bit on the role that he thinks UNESCO wants to and can play as a convener. I think Professor Das was absolutely right. I think all these initiatives, at the end of the day, stand or fall with a very strong political and policy convener in this space. And I'm very happy to see that we're now here at UNESCO premises. I think that's a very good sign. I think UNESCO has that mandate, if you want, deeply enshrined in every piece of paper that we've produced. But is it now a very active strategy of UNESCO to want to play that role? Maybe you can help us a little bit.
Thank you for that question. We all know that UNESCO works through programs and projects, but many programs, and our work in this area also has been guided by programs, and the program that has been guiding us is called Member of the World. That has been a major one. There are other smaller programs, but that has been a major one. That program, I'm sure we are all aware, is experiencing some challenges, and most of the challenges that it's experiencing are not because of the work that it's designed to do. It's political difficulties between countries about nominations and so on, and these do come up once in a while. For instance, if country A nominates a document and claims to be originating from them, then country B says no. We also have a claim on what you're nominating, and then it becomes political. These are things that happen. So that's the difficulties that this program is having at the moment. As a result of that, we cannot at the moment process or accept nominations globally. We are also advising that regional and national nominations also be on hold for the same reason that these disputes must be clarified. Actually, what is being clarified are the guidelines for nominations. How do we verify, how do we consult, and how do we arrive at a nomination that is widely or broadly accepted. That's the direction we're trying to go towards. To answer your question, however, the work has not stopped. There is a lot of work that we can still do, certainly as a region. There is work in terms of looking at our policies. If our policies are ready for cross-border sharing or exchange in this field. There is work on standards that we can still do. It's got nothing to do with nominations. Let's work with standards. Work with policies and standards can be actually from the top, but also can be at the bottom. We can go down to drafting policies that government can adopt. So it can really be concrete work. But there's work also on training. There is work that as I mentioned in my remarks, that we can do to enhance our collections and make it more accessible to people with disabilities. So there's a lot of work that we can work on concretely to move forward the collaboration and cooperation within the region. What can UNESCO do? UNESCO obviously can help with consultations. Consultations within a country. It was interesting to hear concerns, from Bangladesh, because there are similar concerns in other countries in the region about. Even yesterday, I heard somebody outside the auditorium saying that, NDLI is fantastic, accessing the world. What about the archive in the village or in the state somewhere? It's still forgotten. Well, these things they are there, and they need to be attended to eventually. So those realities are, development is still an ongoing process. But before we can even harmonize, if you are get back to the term that we don't want to use here, before we can harmonize the collection, let's have the standards, let's have the policies in place, so that at least as we collect and as we preserve and as we develop this resource, we can then have this also cross-border or transboundary kind of exchange as a platform for collaboration. So UNESCO is there for you in consulting, also consulting within the country, but also in the region. UNESCO is there for you to support, hopefully draft a project that can address some of the specific requirements that we can come up with here. UNESCO also is there to share with you global lessons and guide a process that we may want to embark on as a country, or I would prefer as a region rather than countries, but even individual countries, of course, have got the right to come to UNESCO for lessons, global lessons that we have. Also, we have access to a pool of international consultants, of course. What is a challenge for UNESCO is the resources, the financial resources. But that's where then now we need to work out the modalities. How do we achieve this? But these are there, and UNESCO has access to all these resources if the financial resources are sorted out. That's the brief answer. Or is it a long one? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Delamini. We just take one last question from Mr. Partha.
I'd like to know about your your presentation is so useful and fast, and I'd like to know about the cooperation about the NDLI, National Archives of India, and ASI, because the ASI also working the digital documentation, and National Archives also of India also have a documentation. How you doing the cooperation between the three organizations, because all are working for the digital cultural heritage. So I'd like to know that.
That's a good question, natural question, and there are naturally India is a mini world in terms of size, diversity, and challenges. So on one side, I'm proposing cross-border cooperation, and internally I'm trying to bridge borders between two ministries. So ASI or National Archives, or for that matter, National Library. We are National Digital Library of India, very carefully named. There's a National Library of India. These entities come under Ministry of Culture. They have their own programs of digitization and dissemination. Unfortunately, till date, we haven't seen those digitized items disseminated. For several reasons. This is not the platform to discuss the reasons, but that's the reality. So the way we stand is we have in principle agreement with ASI to cooperate on this. But on ground, nothing has happened. But I'm hopeful always. When we got started in the first phase, several ministries were not even ready to talk to us. We said, you go and create school books. That should be your mandate. But in the second phase, many ministries came and said that why are we not covered? So we will bridge this gap. But certainly when I'm talking about digital heritage, all of these different agencies in India will also have to contribute. But there is beyond this, also there is a huge amount of heritage content in digital form currently also available. So there is ground to start working.
Thank you, Dr. Das.
Thank you, Mr. Vershbow and Dr. Das, for the insightful session.